Hello, YouTube land. This is Brenton Son coming to you from Lexington, Kentucky, the Bluegrass State. Today we have a guest who is a researcher in Florida, and he's going to share his encounter with a white albino Sasquatch. Fascinating. I'm telling you, you don't want to miss this. And then we're going to also touch upon some other things from his research, some excellent footage. And he sent me some still frames to show you. But his research is fascinating, and he actually shows stuff. And I promise you that it is really, really interesting the way he presents it like a reality show. And we're going to talk about these missing campers that were in this area and a cover up. It didn't show up in the news or anything. We're going to discuss that a little bit and amongst some other things. So I hope you enjoy this episode. If anyone out there has a Bigfoot or a Dogman story or any other type mystery genre subject where you've had an encounter or what have you, or some kind of experience, you can contact me at brentonson@gmail.com. And I appreciate every story I get. So without further ado, let's go to the interview. Enjoy. All right, Mark. I've been watching your YouTube channel, and it is fantastic. I think your production quality is great. And I really believe that you're going to have one of the best channels out there for Bigfoot research. And I first seen you on a radio show, Night Callers, Bigfoot, and I heard your encounter and what have you, and I thought that was really, really interesting and how you got into this topic. If you would, let's just kind of start there and tell about how you basically ran into this creature for the first time and your story that you give.
To go into that, I had a couple of different situations that convinced me that there was more going on in the areas that I had been in my entire life here in South Florida than I ever really knew. And it wasn't really until I started to pay attention to what was going on around me, and I was a lot less focused on fishing, because that's really what I was doing. I mean, my brother and I grew up down here fishing, so we would hike into areas that a lot of people, you just can't really get to unless you go through some real thick bush. We have a lot of that down here, isolated, water sources. And we used to hike into these areas a lot. Well, I started to go into these areas after I read a sighting on a BFRO at a place called Grassy Waters Preserve. And I thought, could this really be happening here in Palm Beach County? And if it is, why have I not, been aware of something like this as much time as I spent out there? And then I started taking a look at, what I was really doing when I was out there. And in order to fish at the level that my brother and I like to fish at, you really have to stay focused. And I'm a huge bass fisherman. I used to fish professionally on the FLW tour, and I love bass fishing, man. So, when we're there, we're about it. That's about all we're about is, we're fishing. So I started to go into these areas with a little more focus on what was going on around me. And really the first time that I went to the same preserve that the BFRO encounter was on. And I wanted to talk to the people that worked there, because 2 employees witnessed Bigfoot with 2 other people in this particular encounter that I read on the BFRO. So I was looking to talk to those individuals because they were rangers that worked in the park. And I got stonewalled immediately. And then they said, well, why are you asking about this? And, who are you? And this and that. And I said, well, I'm just, curious about it.
Yeah.
But, I may want to come in here and hike around and start looking around and stuff. And the guy was like, well, listen, if you're going to be conducting any kind of research in here, you need to pull a permit. And I was like, well, I'm just coming in here, man. I'm like, I'm not a scientist. And he's like, well, if you're going to be in here conducting official research or anything like that, you need to pull permits. And he kept saying it. And so basically that got my hairs on end right there. I was like, why is this guy giving me this attitude? I'm looking into the subject. So I left there And incidentally, that particular stretch is on a highway called Beeline Highway, and it's in western Palm Beach County, obviously. But there are some development, some communities, developed in that area that border this preserve. And in any case, I left there, and I was driving down Beeline Highway, and I had in the '90s put the fence up around those preserves, the actual barbed wire fence, the chain link fence. On the side of the highway, they have an 8-foot fence with 2 feet of barbed wire. And I remember distinctly standing in that swamp, sinking these posts and pouring concrete into water and putting this fence up for 9 miles down each side of this highway. And when we went back to set the barbed wire, the county came out and said we had it backwards. And my boss said, no, we don't. This is exactly how it's done. And they said, we want the barbed wire facing in, not facing out. And my boss looked at him, and I'll never forget it because, we're all standing there because there's this big disruption with the county coming in, shutting down the job, saying we got to redo stuff. And they said basically that, or my boss said to the guy, he said, well, why would you want to do that? That's like not going to keep people out. It's going to keep people in. And he was like, just this is the way it needs to be done, and we're not discussing it. And so we had to take down a good half a mile of barbed wire that we'd already put up and reverse it to where it was pointing in. The actual barbed wire jacks were pointing toward the interior of the park. So anyway, I was leaving the park, and from talking with the rangers and them telling me I needed to pull permits to come in there, and I was like, well, this is ridiculous. I was driving down Beeline, and I was looking at the fence, and I saw where a tree had been dragged from the tree line. It was probably 12 feet long, maybe. A trunk of a tree was dragged to the fence line from the inside of the park and thrown on top of the fence. So I pulled over and I started looking at it. And there were drag marks that went off a good 100 yards to the tree line where something had dragged a very big tree trunk and threw it on that fence. So now I was like, what is going on here, man? This is like ridiculous. So I pulled around, and there was a canal that was maybe a couple 100 yards away. And I actually shot some video of this first encounter. And this is what changed everything and got me serious about really going in the field to try to, find evidence. I walked down this canal bank, and I had my fishing pole, and it's on the outskirts of the park. And I was walking in, I was casting, and really I wasn't really fishing, but I didn't want to have any problems with these park people because it was obvious at that point that, they didn't really want anybody in there. And you're not supposed to go in these side entrances. And so I'm walking down there, and there's a barbed wire fence along that side too. Now I didn't put that particular fence up, and it was a little smaller, but I got down in this area and I started noticing the fence damaged in several places on the side perimeter here. And on the other side of this canal that I was fishing is a golf course. It's about 1,000 yards to the first part of a set of apartments, but you got a thick swamp in this preserve right here in this area. And I walked down in there. And I was going down about maybe an eighth of a mile, and it started to curve. And right at the curve, there was a big rock in the water that was sticking out, and it had smashed snails all over it. And I was looking at it, and I'm standing there fishing, and the top of the rock was still wet. Now it's only about 8:15 in the morning, maybe somewhere in there. And I noticed, I know enough to know that the area does have otters. And I've seen them there my whole life, in these canals, you'll see these otters. Yeah. But then I noticed that there was a rock that was about half the size of a bowling ball that was laying next to it on the bank. And there were some weeds pulled out, and the weeds were on the bank. And the rock itself was bigger than what you typically see an otter using. And it had the snails and the mussels and stuff all over it. So I walked over to where the weeds were pulled out over the canal bank. And I looked down in there, and there was 2 big 16-inch punch holes, foot tracks, and they were underwater. But you could see very clearly where something was standing there in that water. And it looked like it had been digging around. And that's right where you find these snails. They're called apple snails or kite snails. And the mussels as well, And so I was like, what? I looked up the bank and followed the obvious trail. And you could see that there was a big impression at the top. It wasn't discernible, but you could see where something big stepped there. So I walked up to Canal Bank, and I crossed over the little levee that I was on, and it dropped down about a foot, and there was the fence of the park, and it was completely pulled down, and the posts were bent in, and something had done that. So I walked over to it, and I thought about it for a second. I was like, am I going to actually do this? And then I stepped in. When I stepped in, right there in front of me was a big track and some grass, and it was the same size as the actual track that I saw in the water, the punch holes, 16 inches. And I was noticing that my boot at 225 pounds didn't leave any. I mean, the grass just stood right back up. Well, this was down, and it was in the ground a good inch and a half. So I started looking around, and I noticed in front of me there was a real thick wall of jungle, and there was a hole in it that was about 50 inches wide, and it was about 8 feet high, and you could see where something was tearing the bushes and breaking branches on this big wall of bush, and it made like a tunnel. And it just occurred to me that suddenly that, you know, the water was still on the rock, and the oyster stuff hadn't been dried out yet. And there's this track now, and the fence is pulled down. And now I'm seeing this, and I was like, man, you know, can this really be happening? And decided to go in. And so I went into the tunnel, and, you know, it wasn't perfectly made, but you could see where something was ripping down stuff, creating a pathway. And there was hog sign in the area as well, where you can see they were rooting everything up. And you know, typically they tear up a lot of ground down here in these areas, especially in the preserves, because you're not allowed to hunt there. So there's a lot of hog. And so I went in there, and it went in a good ways, and came to this one spot where I was, and the whole time now I'm under a canopy. There's no sunlight coming through, and it's bright out, you know. And so it's a little shady in there. It's pretty dark in there. So I'm going in, and then I come to this like clearing, but it's still covered by canopy. And there was a bunch of mud about 20 feet around, maybe 30 feet around, and a big tree in the middle. And you could see where I looked, and across the mud, about 12 feet maybe, there was another big track. And it looked like there was some milling around where I was standing, that you could discern something was there. And it just occurred to me that something jumped across that mud, and it's got a big foot. And this is really happening. And I don't know why I did it, but I let out 3 screams at the top of my lungs. And about 2 seconds after I let the screams out, I heard a groan. On the other side of the tree, there was a patch of bushes, and you could see where the trail, the tunnel, kind of continued through once you got through the clearing. And on the left-hand side of that tree, there was another tree, and there were bushes blocking it. I couldn't see. I heard, and it sounded like a real big guy was irritated that I just woke him up. And the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I heard the bushes move, and it sounded like this individual stood up. So now I was like really kind of, you know, I was freaking out. Is what I was doing. And he let out the exact same 3 screams that I let out, mimicking me.
Wow.
And on the last scream, he had sarcasm to the point where I was freaking out, and then all of a sudden I felt embarrassed. Like I actually felt embarrassed that I did what I did, and he was mocking me. Mm. And then he took off through the bushes, erupted. And I thought for a second I was going to be attacked by whatever it was. Mm. And I turned around so fast and started to run, and my legs were getting tangled up in bushes, and my cell phone went flying. And I had left my fishing pole at the trailhead, but I ran all the way out the tunnel trail, and I could hear this individual smashing stuff luckily he went in the other direction. I went in one direction, he went in the other. I ran past my fishing pole, forgot it was there, ran all the way back to the car, jumped across the hood, and peeked my head up, and there was nothing there. And a semi went screaming by, because it's right on the side of the road, this Beeline Highway. And then it started sinking in that it happened. Yeah. Because I was thinking, I got to be dreaming this, man. This is not happening, you know?
Yeah.
And that's that's what started the whole ball rolling, because right then I was like, okay, let me play it through here. Was it a hog? And there's no way it was a hog, because it sounded like a giant man. That's what it sounded like. There were no hog sounds whatsoever. And I'm very familiar with the sounds they make. I grew up down here. You know what I mean? We have thousands of hogs in Palm Beach County. I mean, we typically see them, you know? And then the amount of bush that was moving, the intelligence, the whole thing. So then it sunk in, and I wasn't sleeping. And I started to get mad. And I was thinking that those people were lying that I talked to. And that's what started this whole ball rolling.
Okay.
At that point, I knew right then I'm going to document the Bigfoot species in Palm Beach County. And that's exactly what I was saying to myself. I'm going to give this the serious attention it deserves, because it was shocking. In my mind, I thought, there's no way that something this significant can happen to me, and these people don't know what's going on.
Right.
In this park.
Well, at this point, though, you basically had heard this, you've seen the footprints, and the reality was setting in, and you've seen the denial from the people who basically are in charge, and you have this incident with the fence being, tilted in to keep something in, but kind of like you talk about, when you have these type of encounters, it doesn't really sink in till you see it. Can you describe the first encounter when you actually saw this creature, because it's very fascinating. Yeah. That right there, I think, is when it really was set in stone that there is something major that is hidden from the public, and your description of this was just fascinating. I thought, and I think that people will really like this story. If you could kind of progress, and we can backtrack to anything you want to talk about.
Sure, yeah. What I know is, up to the day that I saw what I saw, I believed. My son had actually seen one, and he never believed. I took him to my uncle in 2012. He saw it. And I was a little irritated about that, because I put a lot of work into it up to that point. So I was planning my next expedition. And after Mayaka, where Christopher, my son, had his sighting, and he became a knower. And that's the way I look at it. You know when you see one. And so I was like, man, and I had been real frustrated over it. And somebody that I knew had contacted me and said, look, I watched this video you made and on YouTube, and it was really cool. I'd like to come with you sometime. And I was like, okay. He's like, where do you want to go? And I'm a fisherman. So again, I'm like, well, I've been looking at this place up in Martin County, and it's got these huge canals, and they look deep, and they look the right color. And I think there's probably some double-digit fish in there. So why don't we head up there, and I'll basically, show you how to do some tracking. And, who knows,
Right.
But I wasn't real serious about it. I was looking at maybe checking out the area. Now, I hadn't read the actual report on the BFRO that there was a retired police officer that saw this thing.
Right.
Where we were going. I didn't know that. So we got up real early. And anyway, I went to his house, and then we took his truck. And we drove up to Martin County to an area called Hungryland. And if anybody, is not familiar with that, it's the area where the Native Americans hid from the U.S. government during the U.S. government Native American Indian Wars here in Florida. That's where they basically, the government wouldn't go in there. And it's very difficult to get in there in the actual spots where they were. So we went there, and the canals looked great. And long story short, we didn't do too well. And I didn't want to go in the bush until the sun came up, because I didn't know the area. That's something I've learned.
Right.
If you don't know a spot, you won't go wandering into it at night. That's the worst thing you can do, especially if it's flooded, because you don't know how much territory the gators own, and what the population of venomous snakes varies. So from area to area. So I didn't want to do that. And So the sun started coming up, and I looked at a spot off the side into the swamp, and I was like, well, if we don't catch something here in about 5 minutes, man, let's take a walk off in that water and hit that cabbage palm head, because I'm seeing something that looks familiar. And it's funny because what I was looking at from the road was one of those tunnels that I described in that encounter earlier. And you could plainly see it from the road. Now, this was a giant cabbage palm hammock. And so we waded off in there, and we went in there, and we got out to where the edge of it was, and it started to come up out of the water, and you could see very clear tunnel going in this thing. You could even see where it curved. And there was branches, cabbage palms busted off 8 feet, and you could see where this was created. This was not natural. Right. And everything else was real thick, just a wall. And you really can't see into those hammocks. I mean, the palm fronds are huge, so they block your view. Right about then, I started getting a real bad feeling, and then all of a sudden the shotguns started going off. And the shotguns there was a swamp buggy. You could hear this thing coming. I mean, they're loud. I don't know if you ever heard swamp buggy, but I call them swamp dragsters, and they're loud, man. And these guys were firing off shotguns, probably blasting the hogs. I mean, you can kill hogs all day long, 365 down here, and you can take as many as you want. They encourage you to do that. So we started hearing buckshot ricocheting through the saw palmetto or through the hammock, and I was like, we need to get out of here, man, before we take a load of shot, So we backtracked out of there real quick. And we got back to the car, and I was thinking, man, let's find some place that's dry and try to find high ground, because even if we're going to, even possibly come across a track at all, it ain't going to be in the water. It's real dark down here. It's tannic colored. And it's clear, but it's real dark. So anyway, we drove down maybe a half a mile, eighth of a mile, in between that distance, and we come to this spot, and it looked like it was elevated. The trees were higher than everywhere else, and I thought, well, that looks like a spot. So we pulled in, and it turned out to be a place called the Old Indian Town Trail. And it's the beach to lake trail, and it runs all the way from the beach in the easternmost point of this particular area. Jupiter is where it comes out, and it runs all the way to Lake Okeechobee. And there's some interruptions here and there from a highway or whatever, but pretty much you can take this trail and stay in the bush, all the way from the beach to Lake Okeechobee. So we parked and we got out, and I got my buddy here all geared up, and he had all this stuff. And I was like, well, let's go check this trail out. So we started walking down, and you could hear the hunters coming towards us, because we just basically drove down, and they were still coming. They were a ways out in the swamp. And so we're walking along, and there's a ditch, and there's some water coming through from one side of the swamp to the other, and the trail is elevated, and the swamp's on both sides. And we're going, and it's pretty thick on both sides of this thing. We got down, I don't know, man, 100 yards from the car, 150, maybe 200 yards from the car. I don't even think it was that far. And he starts fiddling with his equipment on his belt, saying something's difficult or he's having problems. And I glanced down, and I grabbed it, and I started to pull one of the straps, and I heard gunshots. And I looked up, and here comes the swamp buggy, and they're flooring it. And, you can't see them, but you can hear it, because the bush on both sides of the trail was so thick. But it sounded like they were about 1,000 yards off, and they were shooting off guns. There were several guys on this thing firing, and they're not supposed to do that. I found out later. Right. You're supposed to stop the buggy and shut the engine off. But they were firing, so they must have been on somebody's ass, is what it was. Right. And some hogs. Yeah. But the second I looked up, coming down from an arch across the trail is a Bigfoot. It was the craziest thing I'd ever seen in my life up to that point, and I never thought that anything like what I saw in that 2 seconds that it took him to cross that trail in the air was possible. My eye had trouble keeping up with how fast he was moving. He looked like he had jumped from the swamp, obviously, because the arch wasn't, I'm jumping from the side of the trail in an arch. He was coming down. And he was coming down all the way across the trail. So he had to have jumped from out in that swamp. Right. But he had 7 to 10 inch long gray hair. First of all, he had human hair on his head. It was a mop of silver gray hair. He was all gray silver. You could see every muscle group. The hair was thinner all over this individual in the muscle areas wherever he had like something that would bulge out, the hair was thicker. Like his shoulders, the hair was real thick. But it thinned out on the front of his bicep. And I saw every muscle group on this dude. It got thicker on his forearms, and the hair hung down past his hands. You could see the hair. I saw everything as this was happening. And so I'm like, and I'm watching, and then he was going so fast that in my mind, I just figured he's going to wipe out. Like, all this stuff's flashing through my head. Like, I can't believe this is happening. He's going to wipe out. And then here he just, like, lands gingerly on his tippy toes from, like, 35 miles an hour or more. And like it was nothing. Like he had done it a lot of times in his life. And when he landed, all of his muscles flexed. And you saw the reverberation of the landing.
Wow.
Incredible to look at. And I, for a few seconds there, man, I was like, man, I'm hallucinating this. But then he turned. It was like, I went, oh, or something. You know what I mean? Like, I must have said something, because he turned and his whole upper body turned.
Right.
And he leaned out and he went like this. And he just kind of leaned out from the palm frond, pulling it down, and his hair cleared. And I got a real good look at his face, and I was staring right at him, and he was staring right at me. And it looked like, and I've said this before, and I still say it in my videos. You hear me say it looked like he had wraparound sunglasses on his face. His eye sockets were so deep set and so dark, but his skin on his face was all gray, and it even had, with the sun shining on it, a bluish, pinkish hue too. It was strange, man. And he stared right at me, and he had a scowl while he was looking at me. And then I went right back to my partner, turn the camera on. And when I glanced up, just that quick, the bushes were moving and he was gone. And I never saw him again.
Now, now this jump that he made was just fascinating. Because the trails that you all are walking on are basically levees, aren't they, to control the water?
Levees. That's right.
And they are approximately like 30 feet, 40 feet?
They're 20 feet wide.
20 feet wide.
There are 2 car lanes.
Right.
Like the 8-foot car lanes plus 2 feet on each side.
Wow.
So you end up with 20 feet. And you know, some of them are wider with the grass on the sides, but the ones that we walk on when we're in the bush don't have grass on the sides anymore. It's all bush. You know what I mean? And
he was coming down by the time he entered what would have been that lane that you're walking on. So he had started at least 20 feet out before he ever even jumped, because he was coming down already as he was coming across. Is that correct?
His arc was on the decline when he entered my field of vision on the side of the trail. He was coming down, and he was over the bush. The bush itself was 7.5, 8 feet tall, and he was coming down. And I've had a lot of time to think about this, and I've been back to that area and done measurements and all this stuff. And I can tell you that this is what this is close to what he did before he entered my field of vision. There's a bush there that's about 8 feet wide. Once you clear the trail's like this wide, then you got a bush that's about 8 feet wide. You got 20 feet, 8 feet, and then you got water, a clear spot where you can jump from. Now, it's enough just for him to clear the trail. But he had to have come from that water. And my thinking is, in hindsight, that he was paralleling those hunters. Because I'll guarantee you those hunters were chasing hogs, and they were spooking quite a few of them.
Right.
I think he was trying to take advantage of the hunters. In past shows where I've done with people where they interview me about this, and I hadn't had really that much time to think about it. But now that I've been back in the area and conducted so much research and seen what goes on and seen the patterns that they display, having caught them on film and found all these tracks in there, the hogs are a primary food source. That's the bottom line. Right. And we find most of our tracks around the hog sign, and we smell dead hogs on a weekly basis when we go out there. they're definitely eating hogs. So I think he, and because it's so heavily hunted, I think that they're now, like, we've had an impact on that, on the species there.
Right.
I think they're smart enough to know that when we come in there in those big buggies, those hogs are moving out ahead of the buggy. And what appeared to be happening was he was trying to get out in front of that buggy. And I think that's probably what he ended up doing. And we just happened to be there at the right time. But I think he made, I'm going to say, a 28-foot jump. And that's from measurements,
Right.
28 feet.
28 feet and at least 9-10 feet in the air.
Well, when he was coming down over the bush, he was at least 8 feet in the air. Because when it started to make sense to me that I was actually seeing this,
Right.
when I was like not kind of, I was like, it just was like the weirdest thing I ever saw. Like, it was this giant hairy guy flying across the trail. Like, I didn't even, it was like the last place you'd ever expect to see it because there's so much flat area out there.
Right. Yeah.
And then it's just only so many places, and he was in one of them places where you could get away with hiding. But I didn't know any of this at the time. And it was like,
Yeah.
it was so difficult to process when it was happening. But yeah, it was at least 8 feet. He was at least 8 feet off the ground and coming down. And he was like hurdling too, man. I mean, you should have seen this dude, man. He with his chest, and it was all, I mean, I always heard of Bigfoot having this really thick midsection.
Right. Yeah.
Typically you hear these guys in the Pacific Northwest that are eyewitnesses, and they talk about this tree trunk, abdomen area, the midsection, that middle. This guy wasn't like that. He appeared to be a perfect, like, looked like he belonged on Men's Quarterly for Bigfoot. You know what I mean? Like, this dude was like a perfect specimen. You know what I mean?
Yeah, chiseled.
It was impressive, man. You know what I mean? Yeah,
Right.
Chiseled is the word.
Yeah.
But not real thick trunked, and it was like, everything you would see. I would say it like this. I've said this before. If you took the greatest running back in history in the NFL,
Right.
and multiplied him by 5 in every way, that was this dude.
Right.
You know what I mean?
And how
three to 5, yeah.
And how tall do you think that it was?
Well, originally I thought he was 7 to 7.5 feet tall, and I stick with that. You know what I mean? Like, I'm pretty good judge of distance and size.
And where he parted the palm fronds, you could get a pretty good.
I have done a lot of research in that area and that exact spot. As a matter of fact, the same bush.
Yeah.
And you can see that stuff in our videos.
Right. Yeah.
We'll go over all that, but yeah, man, I'd say 7.5 feet tall. He wasn't giant.
Right.
Like you hear about some of these people talking about 10 feet. But the one my son saw was between 8 and 10 feet tall in my own state park.
Yeah.
This guy was 7.5.
Yeah, and what strikes me too about your videos is you catch all different types of looks. There's some that look more monkey, or some look more gorilla, and this one tended to look more human. It comes off more human-like, but like a mixture of a human and ape kind of look. And the hairdo, I thought that was interesting because I've heard that before, where it actually looked like it had like a hairdo. Is that correct, or am I?
It definitely had that. In my first interview about it, the way I put it is the way I will always put it. He had a rock star hairdo, dude. It looked like he looked like a rock star, and it was actually shiny and like kind of nice looking. It was a little, it was a little nasty in the front. When he leaned out, you could see where it was like sticking together, kind of. It looked like it needed wash. It was all the same length. His features were absolutely not ape. There's no question about that. His features were pre-human, and it was obvious. I mean, looking at him, it was like, it was just, I'm looking at a caveman, and that's the way I describe it. That was a caveman, and that's what started me looking into, like, if science is telling the truth about how, pre-humans didn't have hair all over their bodies, because this dude had hair all over his body, and he looked like a pre-human.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. In our films where you talk about how some of them look more primate or non-human primate or chimpanzee looking or gorilla looking, and that's still family homine.
Yeah.
But what I've come to realize from reviewing footage is that where I get a short clip of something where it may only be 6 to 10 frames.
Right.
They might be good. They might be good frames.
Right. Yeah.
But if on certain angles, when they can appear to be more monkey or chimpanzee looking.
Right.
But on the clips of the same individuals, when I get an extended set of clips of them, and I got a couple hundred or a couple thousand frames, and we do have that, when these individuals turn their heads and they look at you straight on, they have a very human-looking appearance, pre-human-looking appearance. They all have the hooded nose, and they do have an extended upper lip. I'll say that. The distance between the bottom of their nose and the top of their lip is maybe twice that of a human. But I think it's more about just having such a large skull. I don't know. You know, I mean, I look at it like we've caught so many different individuals on film in this one particular area.
And sometimes doesn't the mouth seem to be wider proportionally than a human, though?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, there's obvious differences. And, you know, it's funny because the one thing that we do see as a pattern is they all have the same basic anatomical measurements, like in their facial structure and in their bodies. We catch a lot of faces because of the way we conduct our research. We're trying to get them to come to the edge and look. So we don't have to go in anymore. We tried going in on them and forcing the issue, and they were throwing stuff, and I was getting hit, you know, and all this. And so, you know, the bottom line is that's all in the journals. But if you look at what we do now, we're trying to draw them out, and they will come out and watch, because they're so stealthy, man. They move so slow when they're in that mode where they're trying to sneak up on something, that your eye doesn't pick up any peripheral movement. And you only have the ability as a human being to focus on one area at a time.
Yeah, yeah.
Same with a camera lens. You can pick it up. I mean, you get a good clear image. But when you zoom, it's the same thing. You're focused on one point. So outside of that is basically lens peripheral.
Right, yeah.
And we see that a lot in the thick bush, especially because, you know, you got so many, you know, so much depth and branches in front. But we stepped up our game quite a bit in this last 6 months, man. We're catching a lot of stuff.
Oh,
and
yes,
they do look different, but at the same time, they have a lot of the same traits, you know?
Yeah. You have a lot of really good stuff. And you know, the people who are watching this, they're going to want to go see your videos. I don't recommend going and checking things out that, you know, anymore. This right here, your stuff is, in my opinion, the best out there of a place that you could go and learn something that's quite incredible. And one of the things I really have been trying to come across and convey a message about how good these creatures are at hiding and being stealthy. And you can walk right by them and not know it. So a lot of people are like, well, why don't you catch them more on film? A lot of times you are catching them on film, you don't even know it, and you may never even know it, and that film's sitting in your garage or wherever, and you never do it. But one thing that comes across with your videos is that, for instance, the piece of footage where you were showing your brother how to operate the GoPro steady thing that you had built, and he was trying to operate it, and he was turning around, and you all both were filming, and I like your philosophy, always be rolling, because, you know, you're catching stuff, and you learn that over time, and there was one, you all were going down this trail, and hopefully you'll let me show a few clips of a few things we're talking about. I won't show all your stuff. You've got a lot of good stuff. But as you were going down this trail, there was something stalking beside you, and what you said was so incredible. Because you were talking about these animals being trapped in these certain reserve areas, and their habitat is shrinking. So you believe that this crossbreeding may start happening, and you're seeing signs of maybe some deformities in the feet and things like that. But this thing was coming up beside you, and you said that this was a juvenile that was stealthily moving along beside you all. and you said, "Look at this." And then when you showed its face and it had a snarl, it looked angry, and it's feet from you, 5, 6 feet from where you are, going along beside you, and you didn't even know it. And you said, "What happens when this individual grows up? Will people come up missing?" That was like, golly, this is such a remarkable thing. And another thing I want to tell my subscribers and the people that watch my channel is the way that you approach this is really, really good, top quality video production, better than my channel. And I did this for a living before, but you have absolutely done a fantastic job on the way that you put this stuff together, the time and the care. You know how much time it takes to run a YouTube channel. You know. And I've told people that many times, but the approach that you have, it makes you, it comes off as if you don't believe this, it's foolish for you not to believe it. And we talked about that, and you thought that was quite funny, but you come up with such good stuff that when you look at it, you're always going to have the trolls that come on along with the pareidolia and all that, but you're coming up with way too much stuff. There's a couple things maybe you say, maybe. But you have like a one shot of an eye that you highlight sometimes in your intros and things like that. Just so many good pieces, man. That eye, that's an eye. I don't care what anybody says. And I've got some footage like that on my channel, and I said, that's something right there. I don't care what people would want to say about that. I used to be a professional videographer. I went to a top 3 school in the country and studied broadcasting. I know how cameras work. And I know when I'm looking at something, sometimes it's iffy, but I know that there's sometimes I show you something and I say, this is something. I can tell by several factors of depth of field and focal things and what have you know about, that you can tell when it's an object in the film that's not the background. And can you kind of maybe tell us a little bit about this evolution of capturing these things and some of the things maybe you've learned, and kind of how you go about doing this? It's quite incredible. You've done a good job.
Yeah, I appreciate the compliments, first of all, and I do understand how much work goes into this. I work between 70 and 100 hours a week. This is not some kind of a hobby for me. This is a full-time and then some passion for me. And the filmmaking process especially. I consider it almost a duty that I have the footage that I have to make sure that I put it out there in a way that actually respects what's on the film. And I know what I saw at this point on 3 occasions. That first sighting I just went over, but twice in the same area that we catch all these guys on film. In 2015, I saw the same Bigfoot twice, and we've caught that individual on film as well. But the process of what really changed everything was my perspective changed. And my perspective changed the day that I got screamed at earlier in the show when I told you. Once I knew at that point this is going on, and I still hadn't seen one, I started really looking at what was being said on television especially. And I started to notice that what was happening was they were inducing a lot of questions and not giving any answers. And I kept thinking to myself, I just basically walked off the road here and had something this incredible happen to me. Yeah. And these people are acting like I got to be in the middle of Saskatchewan to have something like this happen. And in fact, I had just finished watching a documentary on the Discovery Channel where they flat out dismissed every single eyewitness encounter in the state of Florida as escaped chimpanzees. And that's no joke, man.
Right, yeah.
I watched through my own eyes. And, at that point, all those things were coming to my head. So I said, is the information that I've received about this subject accurate? Because my experience just tells me that it's not. And so I started to look at myself and my own opinions and my own beliefs on the subject that I had gotten from a lot of the programming that was out there. And I started to say, wait a second, why don't I just listen to the people who know, the eyewitnesses?
Right.
Because these people, I started looking people up, and I'm saying, well, this particular scientist who's always on these television shows has never seen one, and he's saying this, and he's saying that, he's saying this, and this guy's saying that. Well, none of those people were eyewitnesses. And then I would listen to what the eyewitness said, and in most cases, it was directly contradictory to what was being stated in the actual show.
Right.
I just couldn't buy it at that point. So I said, I'm going to start paying attention to what the eyewitnesses are saying.
Right.
And that's what started to change my perspective.
Let me ask you this, too. Because I'm big on the eyewitness thing. The eyewitness stuff is really what convinced me. My sister was an eyewitness. I've had a few encounters, but I didn't see it. I heard it. The one that limbs breaking, throwing stuff and all that. So, but I know the eyewitnesses, when some people say, well, no, this guy's lying, he's making this up. Can you imagine a scenario when there might be some people that are like that, but most of the people that I talk to are regular, sane people? Can you imagine a scenario of making something like this up and then putting yourself out there and saying, I saw, you know what I mean? If you didn't see it, you're not making money from it by telling your story. You're not getting any fame, but you know what I'm saying? There's not some big, huge gain to make. The only time you can ever get any gain from it is if you put a lot of hard work into something, making films like you're doing or doing like what I'm doing. But it's a job. Then you're getting gain from your working. It's not that, what I'm saying. So can you, to me, the eyewitness testimony is as good a evidence, in my opinion, as the footage and the tracks and the, because that's how you get people started in believing it somewhat. And I think it's at least as important. Eyewitness testimony is admissible in court. You know what I'm saying? So to me, what you do is hugely important, and the gathering eyewitness testimony is also hugely important because you can learn from it, I can learn from it, and then it helps you to go out in the field and conduct the research. But can you imagine people lying about it?
Oh, no, absolutely, man. I mean, there are a few sociopaths who take advantage of the subject, and it's very obvious who they are. If you're involved in the subject, you learn real quick as you get in who they are.
Right.
And that's got nothing to do with the eyewitnesses.
Right.
What I can tell you is that the most valuable tool I have as a serious field researcher are eyewitness statements. And I can tell you that everything you need to know about how to research and how to find evidence and about the Bigfoot species is contained in eyewitness statements. Yeah. And I studied those things for almost 10 years. I mean, I studied thousands of them. Right. And I looked at it and I started to develop patterns from that. And the one thing that consistently, if you want a real quick answer for how we do what we do and we find them and then catch them on film, it's real simple. Everything you read in eyewitness statements can only bring you to one conclusion if you actually use an objective mind. And that's that we're dealing with a hunter-gatherer species. Mm-hmm. And from there, if you ask the right questions, you will, A, be able to find the areas that they live in. You will, B, be able to find if those areas are viable habitat and they do have game and all that kind of stuff in it. You're beginning to see patterns in sightings that back this up. And then if you understand the concept to your core of how these things would have to live, how would you have to live if you had to kill a hog with your bare hands? What would you have to do? What would be required of you if you had to hide, if you had to kill a deer, let's say, to gather meat? There's plenty to eat in fruits and vegetables and plant life and all that stuff down here. It's the tropics, man. Tropics start at Lake Worth, Florida. We're right there. We're in the tropics. So you got a jungle out here, man. There's plenty of vegetation to consume. But that can't be the existence. You can't exist totally on that.
A creature that big has to have protein.
Big time. Right. And there's some vegetative, there's some protein sources that come from vegetation or seeds and nuts and this kind of thing. But in South Florida, that type of stuff is limited. The protein sources, the vegetables and all that kind of stuff where you can get vitamins and all that, that's plentiful. But the protein sources that come from vegetation are a little limited. You have to consume so much of it.
Right.
I can tell you this. In looking at how we did this in a nutshell and how we continue to be successful is because I understand what I'm going after. That's the bottom line. When I go into the area, I understand that if these guys don't sit still, and they're going to be in very specific spots.
Right.
Am I going to sit in a bush that in an area where there's no hogs for a quarter mile?
Right.
No, I'm going to find a game trail, and then I'm going to find the biggest, thickest bushes that are in close proximity to that game trail, and I'm going to sit in there because I'm huge. I mean, these are real common sense approaches, and as you can see from the films, it's working out. So we follow these patterns, and we don't veer from it. There's an old saying in fishing: you don't leave fish to find fish. Right. And I stick to that philosophy. This is working for us, and we're going to continue doing that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that's the nature of it. People ask me all the time, why don't we see them more? And I'm like, well, first of all, we're seeing the Bigfoot species, as the American people are seeing the Bigfoot species the exact amount that they should be seeing them. Yeah. Because this is how they live. And I start to tell them that. And I'm like, if you go into these areas, you're probably still not going to see them, but that doesn't mean they're not there. The bottom line is they have to be quiet or they don't eat. If they don't eat, they can't stay alive, bottom line. So there are some very simple common sense answers for these ridiculous rhetorical questions that skeptics and the people we call the trolls continue to inject into this entire subject. When the bottom line is if you really talk to these people, what it comes down to, these skeptical individuals, is that they really have never given the subject the proper consideration that it deserves. In consideration, proper consideration in this subject means you got to get your tail out in the field, objectively evaluate some areas, and spend some time. You can't go out in the field twice a year, man, and expect to, that's like hit or miss,
Right.
So, I look at it in a way that, is very common sense, and I think that that's one of the reasons why we're producing the films and the evidence that we are. I've simplified it as basically I took all the bull crap out of it, threw it away, and started from scratch and just started listening to what eyewitnesses were saying. Yeah. And I can tell you unequivocally, a lot of these people that I've looked into that say, hey, I saw it in this area, they were telling the truth.
Yeah. And it's so incredible, too, that they're not even that far away from the golf course. I mean, it's just so amazing.
Well, that goes into what you were saying about being hemmed in, where I said that about being hemmed in. Yeah. Their habitat, man, down here, they don't have much left.
Yeah. And, well, I mean, even in places like Tennessee where you have bigger wildlife refuges, they still have lookouts that are near the entrances to these state parks because they want to keep track. I believe they want to keep track of who's coming in and make sure that they know if people are going off trail. You can't sneak up on one of these, and that's one thing I like about your approach, too, that you'll never sneak up on a Bigfoot. Every once in a while, one might come across your trail when it's doing its own thing, and boom, accidental kind of jumped across, jumped 900 feet and land, it's like, but you know what I'm saying? But that's the encounters people are telling about. And why aren't people encountering them more? They are. People just aren't coming forward because they're scared of the ridicule. A lot of people see them. And one of the interesting things I was talking to you about earlier is that this encroachment on their territory down where you live, and maybe the resources shrinking some to sustain. I believe there's a lot. I believe there's more than you probably even think in the area where you're at and the research areas you have. And every once in a while, for whatever reason, people come up missing. And I don't know, maybe if it's just a rogue thing, once in a while catch one on a bad day, or if they're maybe haven't ate in a while, or what the deal is. But can you tell us a little bit about the story where the campers there's two different people that had come up missing? That was
absolutely.
Intriguing.
We were catching them on film, and we've been in the area. We knew they were there. They basically let us know that what we were doing when we first went in there was not okay. I was charging the bushes, trying to force them out, and I really had no idea what was in there.
Right.
And they were throwing things, and I got whacked with this big branch, man, across my chest. It knocked me back a couple feet on the ground, and my camera went flying. And and after that, I stopped doing that.
Right.
Well, we started to catch them on film after that occurrence.
Right.
We were in close proximity, and Melanie's got some stellar images, man, of these guys in the shadows, 6-8 feet from her. And you know, I mean, everything I'm telling you, you can see in the journals. That's the good thing.
Yeah. Well,
but
people are going to go start watching those journals more because I'm telling you, they are incredible.
What it is, you know, what the journal is the journal is where I used to write. Now I put it in film.
Yeah.
I used to keep field journals. I have a bunch of them. And now I just, you know, I have the ability to film it, and that's what's going on. I would write it, well, this is what happened, you know, and I'd show it to somebody and be like, yeah, okay, man. Well, you got to back it up somehow, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, you know, film is where we can do that. But we'd been in the area for 4 months, maybe 5 months, 6 months probably, because it was July, August. And I remember it was the nasty hot time of year.
Right.
And in fact, this is an interesting story. We got out of the car and we started walking in, and all these cars are buzzing by, and the gates are all open everywhere, and everything's, you know, it's like, what is going on? Because this is not like that, you know, in this area.
Mm-hmm.
Game warden pulls up, and I'm like, what's going on, man? And he's like, oh, we got missing people. And I'm like, you got missing people, and now, you know, we're not trying to give a real good idea of what we're doing.
Yeah.
Because we understand the reality of the situation where this whole thing is concerned and what's going on. Yeah. So I hit on to a couple of things, and long story short, 2 campers went missing in 2 days from 2 different campsites. Neither one of them knew each other. And that, to my knowledge, has never happened in this area. Now, this particular day is all that's surrounding this entire, you know, prior couple of months is us being in the bushes with gigantic things, and we're catching them on film. So now there's a tension between me and Melanie, and it's, should we go in today? Should we stay out? What do we do? Mm-hmm. And I was like, well, let's just go in. You know what I mean? And we'll just be careful. So we go in, and we're in this area, and we actually went back to a spot where I caught a juvenile on film. We're way in the back of this spot. Now, if something happened in this particular area while you're shooting, and let's say something happened to me,
right?
She's not getting me out of there.
Right.
I got news for it. It's not happening. It's going to have to be leave him there and then have people come get me. Right. Well, this is the actual episode in which we come walking down off the bank, and there's thick brush on each side of us, and there's one that's about 8 feet tall, peeking through the bushes next to the tree, and we walk right past this individual.
Yeah.
About 10, 15 seconds later, I'm standing there because we heard movement on both sides of us. She heard movement on her side where she was standing, and I'm focused on the movement on the right side, so we walk down in there. She's focused on the left side, I'm focused on the right side, then she pans her camera. And I'm holding my camera up above these saw palmettos to try to catch something on film because I could hear this thing walking off.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, from behind us, you hear, "Rah!" like this real loud man. I mean, just huge man. And it turned out that when we walked down the hill, we walked right past one on the left-hand side, and she just started to pan and caught him. And I do a size comparison, and he's close to 8 feet tall, peeking through these bushes of face. But this is going on the day that the game wardens are telling us that people are missing. So we go back a couple days later, and there's another game warden pulling in, and I stopped him, and I said, hey, what's going on, man? Did you guys find these missing people? And he said, well, yeah, they found one of them. And I was like, well, what happened? And they're like, well, we're not sure what's going on there. And I'm like, well, how did he die, man? And he's like, I don't know, man, you know. And I'm like, well, I mean, was it the hairy scaries? And the guy's looking at me, and he's like, you mean the mystery apes? And I'm like, I couldn't believe when he said that. But, you know, he said that, and Melanie and I were just like, okay, you know. And the guy goes, I don't know, man. We got people on this. And then he's like, I gotta get down the road. So he took off. But they never found the other guy. It was never on the news, on the local news, and it was real hush hush, strange.
Yeah.
Because normally something like this is like, you know, there's a missing hiker, man. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
You
well,
could call it that. They're missing camper, you know?
yeah, you know where that falls in the state parks? That doesn't fall under like city jurisdiction and things like that. And that's more of a federal thing. And I think that gives them the ability to hush those things a little more than normal. But yeah, that's very fascinating. That right there, I thought was interesting where he said, you mean the mystery apes? He knew what you were talking about.
Oh, yeah.
And then
When I said hairy scaries, yeah.
Yeah. And
He
then,
knew.
yeah, that was a good one to throw out there, and to see if he would take the bait, and he did. And then another time where you went to report an encounter when you first started discovering this, and they called the wildlife biologist, and she said something to you, which you would think she would ask you, what did you see? Can you tell about that?
Yeah, my son had his encounter in 2012 within, I would say, 2.5 hours of arriving at Myakka State Park. I look at that situation and everything that happened at the ranger's office as confirmation of everything that I had been looking into and thinking at that point. I believe to my core that they are studying the species. They're fully aware that it's in these parks. That they're also that they also have a great deal of difficulty getting rid of them, to the extent that they will violate land trust law. There's a very clear land trust agreement here in the state of Florida and probably in other states that you do not mess with the actual territory once it's been given to the people. It's allowed to return to its natural state.
Right.
And they're in there and they are cutting vast areas of this spot out.
Right.
This has all come from subsequent observations after my son's sighting. When he saw the Bigfoot he saw, we tried to catch up with it. It vanished into the bushes. And I said, what do you want to do, man? And he's like, we should report it, right? I mean, this is what you're supposed to do. And I was like, yeah, man, all right, And I was curious because I wanted to see what their reaction was.
Right.
Well, the forest ranger at the front desk, when he walked in, he said, listen, I need a piece of paper and a pencil. I need to draw something I just saw in your park.
Right.
And she looked right at him and said flat out, is that thing still in here? Like she knew what he was getting at before he even said anything. And he replied to her, yeah, it is. And I want to draw it and file a report. So she gives him the paper and I start a conversation with her and she says, we should call the biologist about this. And I was like, the biologist, huh? Thinking like, what is this all about? And I was like, well, how long is that going to take? You know what I mean? And she's like, oh no, she's in the park right over here. Man, I started having red flags right then because there's no way we could show up on some arbitrary day to Myakka State Park from 300-400 miles away and the other side of the state and just run into this, we're finding tracks right off the main trail, man. And that's how we had the sighting. I followed the tracks in the direction they went. And we're seeing this thing and this biologist like stays in the park and doesn't notice it going on. I didn't buy it. So anyway, she calls her up and they're on speakerphone and she's like, yeah, the biologist picks up. It's a woman and the lady says, I got a couple guys in here that just saw something over here in the park and they'd like to talk with you about it and file a report. And the biologist says right on speakerphone, tell them it was a bear. And I look at my son and my son's looking at me like, man. And so she's like, well, you're on speakerphone and they're standing right here listening to you. You better get over here. So she's like, I'll be right there. So the phone hangs up. Christopher finishes his drawing, and I start walking out. She says, she'll come through those bushes over there on the other side of the parking lot. Just go on out there and wait. So we go outside, and the lady's still talking about how they've been seeing it in the park. The ranger's still talking. And not in a way that she was like, this is what's happening kind of thing.
Yeah.
Not dismissing it. So we walk out there, and the biologist comes out of these bushes off this, there's a trail coming out of the trees, and she comes out and starts coming across the parking lot, and she's in an official park uniform, man. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
She's working for the park services or for, Department of the Interior, obviously, right?
Yeah.
Park Service.
Right.
And so she's like, walks up to us, and Chris is standing there, my son, with his drawing, and she walks up to us, and I'm expecting all this and that, and she just says, "Where did you see it?"
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, trying to introduce us or all this stuff, and she just didn't want to hear it, man. Where did you see it? And I said, well, you made a drawing, and she's like, I don't need to see that. Where did you see it? And so we went in detail and described where we saw it to her. About that time, mower guys start pulling up, and these guys on these tractors with all this tree cutting equipment. And they start, listening to what's going on. And now about that time, I'm like starting to get offended because it's obvious she knows what's going on here.
Right.
And she didn't ask, and like you said, she didn't ask, see the drawing at all. She knew exactly what we were talking about. So I said, you're studying this thing, aren't you? And she's looking at me, and I was like, look, man, what is going on in your park here, man? I've been here a hot, 2.5, 3 hours, 4 hours or something. And my son has already seen this thing. We already found tracks. You got hominid tracks off the main trail. There's people walking all through here. And this thing's gigantic thing's walking out in front of my son. You got to know. I mean, if we're seeing it, you're seeing it. You know what's up. And so you're studying it, right? And then that's when she got real irritated with me. And, she started asking me who I was, how long I was going to be in the park, what was my address, what was my phone number. And I told her I wasn't going to give her none of that. And that whatever I filled out on the camping card was what she was going to get. And she was basically like, well, then we're done talking.
Yeah.
She wouldn't comment on anything and turned around and walked off. So I'm standing there with the maintenance personnel. The maintenance personnel then start asking us a bunch of questions.
Right.
And one guy told me that he was flat out over in that area cutting trees down and using the heavy equipment 3-4 days before that in the exact spot that Christopher had his sighting.
Right.
So, hey, man, I look at that as
they know.
obvious intelligence that not only are they aware of what's going on, but they're willing to turn the tables on you if you bring it up, and start asking questions, because that's exactly what she did.
Right.